Good morning and a very warm welcome to the 13th meeting of the Education and Skills Committee. Our first item of business today is a decision to take items 4 and 5 in private. This will allow a discussion amongst members on the evidence taken today and to discuss the committee's work programme. Does any member object to taking items 4 and 5 in private? Thank you very much to the committee. The next item of business is consideration of 3 negative instruments of subordinate legislation. These are the Education Deemed Decisions Coronavirus Scotland Amendment Regulations 2020 SSI 2020-149, the Education Scotland Act 1980 Modification Regulations 2020 SSI 2020-150, and Nutritional Requirements for Food and Drink in Schools Scotland Regulations 2020 SSI 2020-153. And I'm looking to see if any committee members wish to make comments on these instruments. Thank you to the committee members. Agenda item 3 is COVID-19 school education. The committee has been considering the impact on school education of the coronavirus, and this morning we have an evidence session on the impact of coronavirus outbreak on elements of school education. And I welcome to committee this morning Larry Flanagan, General Secretary of the EIS Scotland, and Jim Thewliss, General Secretary of School Leaders Scotland, and a very warm welcome to you both. This morning we're going to move straight to questions from the committee, and I would like to invite Gail Ross to open. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. Thank you for joining us this morning. I want to start by asking about the return to school in August and this blended model, which a lot of parents have contacted me with concerns about. We've been told by the Cabinet Secretary, and it's also in the strategic framework, that local authorities will have to have developed their own local plans. Can you tell us how the voice of teachers has been taken into account in the development of the Scottish Government's plans, and how should teachers and parents input into the local authority plans?
Thank you. If we go to Mr. Flanagan first, thank you.
Thanks very much, Convener. Well, the primary route for discussion has been the Education Recovery Group, which both Jim and I are members of, and beneath the main body there have been 10 work streams which have been developing advice, and those work streams have drawn membership from across all of the teacher trade unions. So there's certainly been input into the discussions around how we address the challenge of COVID-19 in terms of education. We're at the stage now where it's moving out to local authorities. There's a recommendation within the SERG material that LNCTs, the local negotiating committees, should be involved in those discussions. That's happening in most authorities, not universally at the moment. But a lot of that discussion is around the mechanics of the length of the school day, the pattern of attendance. Over and above that is probably the much bigger issue of the actual education content and how we deliver classroom teaching, and how blended learning works. Education Scotland are developing a resource package to support schools in that. But if you've had a look at the EIS survey, you'll see that one of the concerns of teachers around next August is that they have adequate time to prepare for what will be a very different way of delivering education. So if you're only going to be seeing your pupils for a third of the time that you normally would, that is a really significant challenge. And blended learning can mitigate some of that damage, but it can't absolutely restore all of the learning elements. So I'm very clear that blended learning does offer us some useful platforms. In a normal situation, blended learning could have some very strong strengths to recommend it. But we are operating in a deficit model. Children attending school for under half of a normal week will have an impact on those children's learning, and in particular will have an impact on those who are most disadvantaged already. Because even if we take steps around addressing IT inequities, there's still a huge challenge around the ability of families to support young people in their remote learning. And I think there's a huge issue for us there to look at how we actually provide additional support for the most disadvantaged, because from our member survey, the biggest concern that members have is that the disadvantaged already suffered as a result of poverty has been more deeply entrenched by how we're having to operate at the moment. So I think as a society we need to give that some serious thought and look at how we can address some of those challenges.
Thank you. Can we move to Mr. Thewliss?
Thanks, Convener. I agree entirely with everything that my colleague.
Sorry, can I, Jim, we can't hear you. I don't know if it's a problem with the broadcasting, but I think I'll put it onto the clerks to maybe get in contact with you and see if we can improve that connection and come back to you. Sorry about that. Ms. Ross, did you have another question for Larry at this point?
Yes, absolutely. A couple of questions actually. Just to follow on, Larry, from what you were saying about the teachers feel that, or certainly there might be a feeling within the profession of the lead up and not having enough time to prepare. How can the local authorities support teachers in order to prepare? Is that going to have to mean coming in over the summer holidays? Is it just going to be a senior management team? Is it going to be faculty heads? Is it going to be all teachers, or is it going to be up to each individual school?
I think there's a huge challenge for Education Scotland to look at how it supports schools, because one of the ambitions is that in the blended learning approach, Education Scotland resources will be packaged in a way that teachers can just simply use them, almost off the shelf, because one of the difficulties once pupils are back, even if you're teaching smaller groups, you will be teaching full time, so all teachers will be fully class committed for the whole week. So there'll be limited time for those teachers also to be doing the blended learning approach, because to do that effectively would almost be a full-time job. So the thinking at the moment from the Education Recovery Group is that the package from Education Scotland will match progression in the curriculum in a way that teachers know what will be available and can reference it as part of their classroom teaching without necessarily having to do all of the preparation and correction. Now, that's a theory. Education Scotland are, I think, working quite hard just now. And at the Education Recovery Group yesterday, we had a report on some of the progress that's been made. So they are hoping to put out into the system this month an indication of how that would work, at least in the first few months. There will be an ongoing project. But so teachers will know, for example, if they're teaching two-dimensional shapes as part of the primary curriculum, then on top of what they're doing in the class, there is this resource which will be on the GLOW website from Education Scotland, which they can direct pupils to in terms of reinforcement or exercises. The role for local authorities there, I think, is to provide that additional support, because I think we are looking for Education Scotland to have a national resource that everyone can tap into. Locally, I think schools will need support around how you get that additional support for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. So you've possibly seen that the drive to try and recruit former teachers or people who are on the register. A lot of them might be reluctant to go into schools, or there might be a limited capacity in schools. If you only so many classrooms, you can only have so many teachers. But one area that might be useful is for some of those staff to be employed as peer support, tutor support, so that children from disadvantaged backgrounds get an adult support who can provide additional reinforcement around the teaching aspect. So that's where I think the local authority has a particular role as the employer in trying to provide that additional resource to schools to support the work that's taking place.
Okay, thanks. Last question.
Yeah, thank you, Gail. I was just to say we have Jim back in, Gail, if we'd like to try and go to Jim again just to answer the questions before your final one. Thank you. I wonder if broadcasting, if we could try switching the video off for Mr. Thewliss and see if we can get just sound from him, if that's possible. Jim, can you try speaking again? Oh, I'm really sorry. We've obviously got severe gremlins in the system this morning, so we'll try and get Jim back online again. For now, we'll go to Ms. Ross for our final question.
Thanks, convener. So, Laurie, this one's for you again. Teachers have contacted me. There's been a lot of discussion, and it's in the Scottish Government's strategic framework again, about the limited evidence about how the virus affects children, how they can be asymptomatic, how they may be carriers, etc., etc. But, you know, this would leave teachers and classroom assistants with an element of uncertainty. And there is a bit in it about test, trace and isolate, and also the use and supply of PPE. But some teachers, especially in a primary school setting, are very reluctant about wearing a mask, in the classroom in case it's a bit intimidating. So the questions about PPE, I think, still have to be addressed. Who would supply that PPE? Would that be up to the school itself, or would it be up to the local authority, or would it be a Scottish Government responsibility?
Well, before I answer, can I just say to the convener, before Jim got cut off, I did hear him say he agreed with me, so we can take that as a given. The issue of PPE, I think, is quite complex. So to date, in terms of the hubs, there has been agreement where staff are working in close proximity with young people, such as supporting their mobility or their toileting arrangements, then PPE is appropriate. And that's been made available particularly in ASN hubs which have been operating. We have had a lot of queries from members around whether PPE is required. Current guidance is that by and large, unless you are physically close to young people, then it's not required. It will be available in schools primarily to deal with any incidents of pupils or staff becoming ill and showing symptoms. So PPE will be there in terms of immediate isolation and making sure that the infection is confined as much as possible. I think there's the issue that's come up in particular around the return to school is not so much PPE in the kind of clinical sense where it's a specific requirement because of proximity, but just even the general rule around face coverings. And I mean face coverings as opposed to face masks. Members are asking if you have to wear a face covering in a supermarket or on a train, why wouldn't you wear it in a classroom where you're in a confined space with a multiple number of others? The line we've been taking so far is that if you wish to wear a face mask, then a face covering, then you should be allowed to. And what you do is you actually explain to the children why that's happening. There may well be a number of young people whose parents send them to school with face coverings as a precaution. And I think there does need to be some consistency of message from government. So face coverings are seen as being important in X, Y and Z venues. It's difficult to see why they're not important in school environments. I do take the point that for some young people it may be off-putting. Some teachers may not wish to wear them. I don't think it should be compulsory. But I think loads of young people would understand why somebody's wearing a face covering. They're going to have to understand why they're 2 metres apart from one another. So you're only adding to the explanation a little bit. And I think there needs to be some flexibility on that, because we just can't get away from the fact that no matter what the evidence tells us, that evidence quite often is contested anyway. So it's which bit you want to listen to rather than it's absolutely solid. And people are worried. People have their own health concerns. So I think trying to reassure people around their own personal safety is probably fundamental to actually having them work effectively in the classroom. So I think we need to be fairly flexible around issues like face coverings once pupils and staff are back come August.
Okay, thank you.
Just before we move on, could I ask a quick supplementary on that, Mr. Flanagan? You said about flexibility and it not being compulsory on teachers, but do you think there's a risk that parents will feel uncomfortable with the thought that certainly in the secondary setting, that pupils could be moving to different classes where teachers are taking a different approach, and if they feel face masks are important for the teacher to be wearing, it could undermine their confidence in the safety of the school environment?
Well, I think all of that would be down to communication. So if the reasons why things are happening are explained to both students and to parents, and that involves the element of personal choice around how people are dealing with their own concerns, I think that can be resolved. I don't think it would necessarily undermine confidence in the school setting. I think there may well be young adults in secondary schools themselves choose to wear face coverings because of their own concerns. In the guidance, there's a recognition that in class there's a 2 metres physical distancing, but that's more difficult to police when students are on their own time at lunch or at breaks. So I think by and large our young people are quite responsible, and if they want to use face coverings, as with any individual teacher, I think as long as it's clear as to why that's happening and why there is a choice around it, I think we'd probably be okay with that, Convener.
Thank you. I'll move to Mr. Greene.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr. Flanagan, and good morning to everyone. Can I just take a step back? We've sort of dived straight in at the deep end talking about blended learning, but at which point do you think anyone has questioned what the point of blended learning is about? Because I've had a lot of emails from teachers and parents who are genuinely concerned about the effect this is going to have on the education of their young people. Now, I appreciate that the premise of this is safety and health related, but what evidence do we have that attending 2 or 2.5 days a week is any safer than attending 4 or 5 days a week? What conversations has your organisations had with teachers who are perhaps not entirely on board with this blended learning approach?
Well, 2 aspects to that. One is blended learning as a concept is not COVID related. So blended learning exists in the education sphere anyway. And one of the things that Education Scotland is looking to do is actually publish some of the research around the ways in which blended learning can be very effective. I'm certainly of the view, were we not in a COVID-19 scenario, and we were simply looking at using blended learning as an additional tool, then it would be a very effective additional tool, because it can in many ways bridge the gap between school and home and allow quite a lot of reinforcement around the attainment gap. Having said that, I do think we're in a deficit model using it in the current situation. The specific issue around the schools, the only reason why schools can only offer 2 or 3 days to a pupil is because of the need for physical distancing in the school. So if there was no physical distancing, schools could be back, but that would be a health risk because we've seen the demonstrations on our TVs recently, where physical distancing has been set aside as people gather to protest at various things. And one of the comments is always around the lack of physical distancing has given rise to an increased risk of COVID-19 infection because people are just mixing. So if we reach a stage where physical distancing is no longer the government directive around protecting public health, then the capacity of schools will increase. But until we can get pupils back in normal class sizes, or actually smaller class sizes, because we support smaller class sizes as a principle, then we are going to have to live with blended learning. The other option is that we simply do what we can in school. To me, that is simply increasing the deficit, because although blended learning isn't a perfect solution, it certainly gives us additionality to the time that's going to be in school. So I think, to be honest, we are where we are with it. There's no easy solution to it, but the public health safety message is critical, I think.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that, and I think we are where we are, but that doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't challenge things. And your organisation represents a large body of the profession who have to deliver this government policy. So, if there is concern that it's not the right approach, then I would hope that you would be vocal about that. And I think what parents are saying is, how on earth are we going to be able to go back to work when it's safe to go back to work? If my child's only at school 2 days a week and I'm supposed to be supporting them at home virtually or dialing into lessons or doing what we've been doing for the last couple of months, the idea that they're going to be able to homeschool indefinitely until schools are back up to normal capacity, I think is going to prove really challenging for a lot of parents. Even teachers. I had an email from a teacher yesterday who said that they've been asked to go back in June. But they're also having to stay home to be, the parent of childcare, and they've been given no provision for their own children. So teachers have children too, and I guess my concern here is that we are so focused on means to an end, i.e. we need to have the distancing measures in place, that we forget about the effect that that's going to have on the education of our children. I mean, how equipped are teachers currently to deal with this blended learning approach on a long-term basis?
Well, there certainly is a challenge for a number of teachers who have underlying health conditions who are shielding. I think a survey indicated around just under 30% of teachers who have got personal childcare responsibilities. That is being looked at. The childcare responsibility has been looked at in terms of the childcare provision being made on an ongoing basis in the way it will have to be for children of key workers, depending where we are in terms of COVID-19. I think teachers do have concerns. I think the blended learning approach come August will be different from the home learning that's taking place just now. So it wouldn't rely so heavily upon parental involvement, because the teachers will be directing it much more specifically in terms of the in-school provision and how that matches the home learning. But that does depend a bit on the age and stage, because clearly for younger children, parental involvement is a key motivation to actually getting the work done in the home environment. But I agree with you that this is not an ideal situation. Lots of issues within it. We are committed to trying to make this work, but we have also said to Scottish Government and to COSLA there are huge workload implications in this. Even in terms of the current arrangements, one of the issues in our survey, 60%, 70% of staff saying they actually found it difficult to separate out their working day from their family life, because online is kind of ever present. So there are certainly a lot of concerns from the profession, but I think there's also quite a strong commitment to trying to make sure that we deliver it as effectively as possible for young people, because by and large that the home learning experience, people feel that schools have worked well on that in a collegial approach. But I have actually said elsewhere that the blended learning challenge next year is the biggest curriculum challenge of the century. So if we thought Curriculum for Excellence was hard, wait until August the 11th. There's a huge challenge ahead of us.
Yeah, I'm minded to agree with you, Larry. I think you're right. We're staring down the barrel here of a very difficult year ahead for young people, and the consequences that will live with these people for a long time, throughout their whole lives. So, and I can also say, I think we should say, and I know others will join me in thanking a lot of the teachers and school staff who will be watching this, for everything they've been doing throughout the last couple of months. It's important to get that on the record too. What commitments and reassurances have you been given that your members are going to be regularly tested for COVID-19? Because that may be one way of helping put some minds at rest. Is there any commitment they will be tested at all before they go back into schools? Is that going to be an ongoing thing? And have there any commitments been given to the amount of resource they're going to be given? I've heard of teachers that are having to use their own computers and laptops and are making up school resource. They've been given nothing at all, and they're relying on their peers to help them. So there doesn't seem to be any centralised approach to resourcing teachers for this new model. So, how confident are you that they're going to have everything they need to do their job safely and properly?
I think there are two challenges within that. One is around resource, because, again, even in terms of the current situation, there's a kind of assumption that teachers would be well versed and well able to deliver remote teaching and learning, but actually lots of teachers face the same challenges as pupils in terms of limited internet access, or hardware that didn't work. Jim can't go on with his SLS SuperTop laptop this morning, so working remotely is always a challenge. And we do think there needs to be recognition of the resource that is required there. And I'm aware that we're keen to recruit teachers to support this effort, and yet some local authorities are offering temporary posts rather than permanent posts. Some have suspended the recruitment. There is a dialogue going on in the background between Scottish Government and COSLA around additional costs. That needs to be resolved, because we cannot cope with the demands that are going to be made next year without additional resource, without the money to pay for extra teachers, without the 30 million the Scottish Government provided for IT equipment. It was very welcome, but it kind of gives you an indication of the scale of the need that is there. So I think if you look at the additional support needs that exist in our schools, the staff that will be needed beyond teachers to support young people's well-being and resilience in what's a very traumatic period for them, I do think there is a huge cost to be borne in order to make this work. And the last thing we need is a wrangle around what money is available. So I understand that COSLA and Scottish Government have to have these discussions, but we would like to see a very strong commitment to making sure that the funding is there in schools to deliver whatever is necessary on behalf of our children and students.
Thank you. I don't want to take too much time. No, that's fine. No, the only last point, and it's not a question, it's just I did my last question ask about the issue of testing. If the government's made any commitment to teachers, if they're going to be tested at least once, if not regularly?
No, that is an ongoing discussion. So our initial concern was around test, trace and isolate being in place, and there's progress we made on that. There is then a discussion to be had and I'm part of an SCUC group that's also discussing with Scottish Government around proactive testing in order to manage. So it's obviously happening in the care homes now. There's been a discussion around the fire service because of the way that the shift patterns work there. And I think there certainly is a debate around whether proactive testing would control and make safer the school environment. I don't think it's absolutely straightforward because you have to test every kind of phase, so it's quite a strong commitment, but it's an area that's under active discussion at the moment. We would welcome some clarity around that. I think it would be reassuring for staff.
Thanks.
Thank you. Can I bring in Mr. Gray? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Convener. So in a way, this follows on from Jamie Green's last question. I mean, I think, and Larry can disagree if he thinks I'm wrong here, but there's been a better consensus developed between government, local authorities and teaching unions with regard to when schools might be able to reopen than perhaps we've seen in England, for example. And so we have had some agreement around the possibility of starting on the 11th of August. But the EIS did set out some quite strong red lines, one of which was test and trace in place, and there were others as well, which he said had to be in place for that to actually happen. And helpfully, the EIS have shared with the committee the letter they sent out to their local representatives, which has a very extensive checklist, over 35 items, I think, of things which need to be in place before schools can open safely and the kind of blended learning and so on that we're talking about can start. So my question to Larry is, what's the progress been on the ground? Because a lot of these things will only be at a local authority or even a school level. And I just wonder what the feedback he's getting from EIS local branches is about the consultation and the progress in putting all these things into place.
But I would agree with you, your first point, Ian, around there being a stronger consensus through the Education Recovery Group around the potential restart date in August. So again, that's caveated by if the health situation allows it to happen, but we've avoided the kind of fracture lines that have occurred in England, so that is very welcome. Having said that, I think in a sense you've hit the nail on the head asking about local discussions, because although there has been a broad consensus at a national level, there has certainly been some difficult areas in relation to individual councils. We have had some difficult discussions with COSLA around progress in SNCT circulars, which seem to get caught up in COSLA's internal approval system. Yesterday I was on with our local association secretaries, so in a number of councils agreement has been reached to make sure that risk assessments are taking place. The deep cleans or enhanced cleans are taking place, and all the public health mitigations are addressed in terms of how buildings operate. But there are a number of councils where we are moving rapidly to a dispute situation because one local authority saying it simply didn't have the money to do an additional clean and therefore they wouldn't be doing it, but the schools would still be reopening. They said, well, there's a national agreement that cleaning the buildings is a prerequisite for them reopening. So we're in a dialogue there. Some local authorities instructing all staff to be in schools from Monday. Right, very clear guidance that staff should be back in small groups for the purpose of preparing for next year, and that public health remains overriding concern. So there have been and there are still some areas to be sorted out in terms of individual local authorities. the national guidance was that Education Recovery Group indicated LNCT should be involved in that, and we're trying to use those mechanisms. Because one of the things that we're trying to do is avoid dispute on these areas. So the public health guidance, I think, is pretty clear. COSLA were involved with the Education Recovery Group, so the guidance that's come out from there is agreed guidance. Just operationally, we have to make sure it's put into effect, so that we don't end up with the kind of disputes that we've seen in England, which simply drain away, energy and morale at a time when we want to be working together to try and deliver effectively. So hopefully we'll get some of those fires put out and be on an even keel in terms of moving forward.
So is it fair to say that some of those problems, or maybe the bulk of those problems, are resource related, and it goes back to the point you made in answering Mr. Greene, that resolution to the discussions about what additional resources are required by local authorities to deliver the safety measures in schools so they can reopen safely?
Yes, I think most of them, one or two of them, are just administrative operational issues, but I think lying behind a lot of it is a desire on the part of local authorities to achieve additional funding for additional costs arising out of COVID-19. So there is that dialogue is going on. From an EIS point of view, we've been here before in terms of COSLA and Scottish Government debating the pros and cons of the resourcing. Our view is that if we have an agreement on the measures that are required, then the resource has to be found to deliver those measures. Otherwise, all the effort in reaching an agreement becomes a bit pointless. So I don't know what stage the discussions are at. I know discussions are taking place between COSLA and Scottish Government. We would hope they were resolved early, so that we don't end up with these fault lines across a number of councils when, as I say, we need maximum unity in moving forward.
Okay, thanks. My final question, Convener, is...
Mr. Gray, sorry to interrupt. Just before you move on, Mr. Thewliss is back with us. Right. I wondered if you wanted to hear from Jim on those first two questions that you had, hopefully. Mr. Thewliss's mic is still muted.
Sorry, thanks. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, we can and see you. Thank you. Welcome back, Jim.
Good back. Yes, thank you very much for that, Ian. The one thing I didn't hear were the two questions which you asked Larry. I heard the responses, but more than happy to come back to maybe if you want to ask any further.
Okay, go back to Mr. Gray.
Well, maybe I could ask my last question, and I think both Jim and Larry might have hopefully a view on this. And this really goes back to some of the questions that Gail Ross opened with around, and some of the responses that you gave, Larry, because you talked there about the importance of additional support for young people who face the greatest barriers to educational achievement. And the extra support that they might need to try and mitigate the impact of these months of lockdown. And I thought it was particularly interesting that you talked about perhaps deploying retired teachers or additional teachers that have been taken on to give them tutorial support, face-to-face support. And I just wanted to ask you to enlarge on that and to ask if you think that is really the critical factor when it comes to support for those young people at the wrong end of the attainment gap, that it is face-to-face personal support from teachers, which is the thing which will really make the difference for them.
Well, I think the short answer to that is yes. I do think addressing any additional support needs, whether they arise out of poverty or English additional language or specific needs, is labour intensive. It requires staff to work with the students. The ability of staff to do that in schools is going to be limited by, for all the reasons that we know. But I do think we should be looking at how we deploy additional resource to support disadvantaged young people in the blended learning model. I mean, one of the research findings around the MOOCs, the free university courses, was that most of them, despite the fear that they were going to take over from universities, most of them ended up falling because people don't maintain their motivation over the length of a course. So working remotely does require motivation, and for a lot of young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, that's one of the missing ingredients. So having that kind of mentoring support, I think, would be quite critical. It also plays to the strengths, because I can't see a lot of retired teachers who by definition are going to be older and being particularly keen to go back into classroom settings, but they may well be interested in working with young people in an educational way, but in a slightly different arrangement than just simply being in the classroom. Our EIS, along with other Education International teacher unions, have raised the idea of we need to have an equity audit. We need to really look at the impact of COVID-19 and the school closures on the most disadvantaged, and then actually have an action plan to address that. Because if we don't have an action plan to address it, then we'll simply see that disadvantage deepening. And as someone said earlier, it won't just be impacting over the next year or two. It will actually leave a lifelong deficit in those young people's school experience. So I think we would probably argue that's the number one priority, to make sure that the challenge of delivering equity is addressed in a meaningful way as we move back into schools restarting.
Thank you.
Mr. Thewliss?
Yes, take it a wee bit further and develop it a wee bit in a different way from what Larry has said. The first priority here in relation to the way in which we start to promote a move back to normality within education is in the first instance to start to engage. The secret to any successful educational programme is the level of engagement between the young person and teachers within the schools. And it goes, and you take that further into the particular circumstances that we're discussing just now, about those youngsters who, even before we were in the situation we're in just now, engagement was an issue for them. So if we, in the first instance, start to look at engagement across the board, start to then use the resources which we have, any extra resources which we can find, if it is to look at people coming back into teaching, start to target it in a way where we actually do start to engage and support. And thereafter, as Larry said, the equity audit is going to be absolutely critical to what we do here, because the level of engagement and the detail of the engagement is going to be based on the knowledge and the level of understanding which we have of where these young people are within their learning. So we're at a very early stage within this. We've never been in this type of circumstance before. But if you roll it back to the kind of general first principles, a level of engagement, a level of understanding, and a level of pedagogical development, which enables us to engage with learners in a way which is meaningful to them at a point within their learning where we can actually start to make progression. That then, if we've got a level of engagement, makes the audit and the equity audit a more meaningful exercise in understanding how we can actually make up the deficit which undoubtedly is going to be there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can we move to Beatrice Wishart, please?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, colleagues, and good morning, Mr. Flanagan and Mr. Thewliss. I'm pleased to see that we've managed to get both panel members back. My line of questioning is actually around vulnerable children, and it follows on probably from what Gail Ross and Ian Gray have been asking about. At the beginning of this pandemic, teachers recognised and understood how important it would be to make sure that vulnerable children are supported properly during lockdown, and providing care for these in hubs, made a lot of sense. But we're aware that many of those identified haven't been attending. And local authorities are now being asked to increase these numbers So can I ask if you think the measures being introduced, what you think about the measures being introduced to achieve this? And do you think that local authorities struck the right balance in supporting vulnerable children in hubs while supporting families in their homes?
We'll go to Mr. Thewliss first this time. Thanks.
Thanks, Convener. To perhaps answer the second part of your question before we get to the detail of the first part, and that given the speed with which this moved at the beginning, I think the way in which it was addressed was perhaps the best and most effective way in which it could have been addressed. What has happened gradually through the course of the past 10 to 12 weeks is that schools, and particularly guidance staff within schools, have begun to understand a bit of the dynamic which is happening in relation to vulnerable young people not engaging with the system. And through the systems which exist within schools, we've managed to start to make some sort of contact and engage with those difficult to reach families and difficult to reach young people. I think we're at a critical stage now, between now and the summer holiday, in the way in which we're going to involve or bring staff back into school, and the priorities which we set at this point over the course of the next 2 to 3 weeks, to set up a level of engagement which is going to kind of rehash the conversation we just had with Ian Gray, to kind of set up a system of engagement which is actually going to look at the learning pathways which young people have had disrupted over the past couple of months, to start to re-engage and make learning something which is a sensible process and an understandable process for young people and their families. Now, we don't know what that level of intensity is going to be come August. The health protocols and everything else will change between now and then. But it's important over the course of the next 2 to 3 weeks that we start to put systems into place and start to work very, very assiduously in gaining some level of engagement with those who are disengaged.
Mr. Flanagan?
Yeah, the evidence from our survey was that the hubs worked well for children of key workers who were regular attenders, but didn't really work effectively or engage, as Jim was saying, effectively with vulnerable children, many of whom just simply didn't attend the hubs. I think some schools and some local authorities have worked very hard to overcome that challenge by simply reaching out through staff visiting families or through social work involvement. I think there is a need for this to be more than just schools in terms of looking at the those at risk, those who are most vulnerable. I don't see any real prospect of getting significant numbers back over the next couple of weeks. Some local authorities are actually moving their hub provision to a childcare provision in preparation for the service that will run over the summer. And when we come back in August, it won't be hubs, it will be a childcare provision for children and key workers. But the point that Jim made there, I think, is critical. The challenge has been about engaging with those who are most at risk. And we do need to look at that quite specifically. I wouldn't blame anyone for what's happened in relation to the hubs. The offer was there, and efforts were made to try and keep people engaged. The fact that everybody was in lockdown and therefore people weren't required to be at work, perhaps supported why some parents kept their children away from the hubs, even when they're entitled to be there, because they were at home anyway. There was a level of fear around the risk of being involved in school buildings. So I think we can look back and say, the best effort was made at the time, but there is now a deficit because of how it actually developed. And looking forward, we do need to make sure that we factor in an additionality around addressing that deficit. Otherwise, it won't be overtaken.
Ms. Wishart?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with some of the points there about the concern with parents about children actually going into the buildings, and also the fact that many of them were home themselves, so there was little point. I have a particular interest in the impact on children who grow up in households that experience domestic abuse and the often long-term effects of that. So, and I appreciate you've already touched on this before, but how and whether the long-term educational impacts of the lockdown on certain groups of children, I mean, from deprived households, how might that be measured and mitigated in the months and years to come? I think we've got a real opportunity here to move forward in what's been done in the past. I wonder if you agree with that.
Mr. Thewliss?
Yes, Ms. Wisher, that I agree with. There's a challenge, there's an opportunity here, and there is also a challenge, because the group whom we are talking about is not going to be the same group as we had identified, and schools were comfortable in knowing they had identified at the beginning of March. The trauma which has visited families and individuals between that point of time and now and into August is going to mean that the group we're going to be looking at are a different group. It's going to be an expanded group with different types of problems and challenges facing them. So schools are well aware of that. There are systems within schools for engaging with disengaged families, engaging with young people who have challenges in their life and challenges in engaging with education. It's important that we understand, and I think we do understand, that we're going to have to ramp up the way in which we actually communicate with, listen to, get in touch with, go and find out what's happening within the school community in relation to addressing the issues which you describe, and one or two issues which are out there as well. Because there are things which will happen and things which will be revealed to teachers which have never been part of the kind of acknowledged identification of disadvantaged or acknowledged identification of abuse, which we're going to have to be acutely aware of and put systems into place to be able to deal with. So, if, for example, we have a young person who walks through the door in August and reveals in all innocence and honesty that all the way through the past 3 months their house has been partying every night, then that's a major type of issue, which is unknown to us in the past in that sort of context, but we've got to start addressing in relation to the way in which we support that young person and that young person's family. So it's not just, let's say, rewind, reset and take it forward from where we were in mid-March. It's actually to start to look at a completely new system and have a completely new understanding of the life and the lifestyle that young people have been experiencing during that period of time.
Mr. Flanagan?
Well, to echo Jim's point, really, I think the experience of COVID-19 has revealed just how deep the fault line is in terms of the inequalities in our society. I think people have become much more aware of the challenge around low wages and absolute poverty. And we do have, and we will have, an increasing number of young people who have been severely traumatised throughout this lockdown process. And when they come back into school, the school offers an opportunity to try and address some of that trauma. I think it's useful to know that the curriculum workstream from the CERG has prioritised children's health and well-being, including their mental well-being, as the key priority for what we're terming the recovery curriculum. So when we go back into schools, the assessment we're interested in is not necessarily about educational progress, it's assessing the well-being of the young people and making sure that we are nurturing them in the environment of the school, which for many is a strong, safe environment. But it almost kind of comes back to Ian Gray's earlier question. Schools have been stripped out of educational psychologists, they've been stripped out of some of the additional support staff, especially staff that work with young people. So we need more counsellors, we need more specialist staff, and all of that requires additional resource. But I'll repeat the point I made earlier. Working with young people who are damaged by their life experiences is a labour-intensive process. and you need to spend time with the young people. So you need to have the staff there to do that. And I think if we do carry out an equity audit, that will be one of the strongest messages that come out of it. That we need to resource remediation to deal with the very real trauma that a significant number of our young people will have experienced. And obviously there will be some young people who have come through lockdown relatively unscathed, other than missing their friends and being at school. But we need to address the needs of those young people who will have been damaged and potentially have experienced things that we would wish they hadn't experienced as part of their young lives.
Thank you. Ms Wishart, did you have a final question?
No, I'll just leave it at this stage. Thank you, convener, and thank you, panel.
Thank you, that's very helpful, because I do have a few members still yet to come in, all of whom want to, so I'll move to Mr Johnson. Thank you. Can we have Mr Johnson?
Right, I've unmuted myself. Yeah. No, I just unmuted myself. So thank you very much, convener. Some of the issues I was wanting to raise have been touched upon by colleagues, but really what I'd like to do is look at what the kind of the requirements are in terms of blended learning and what teachers need to deliver that. But before I do, I'm going to just pay tribute to teachers. I mean, I think teachers have been going to extraordinary lengths and put in a huge amount of effort to make home learning work. I mean, I guess my central concern, and especially reflecting what Larry Flanagan was saying about with the blended learning in the new school year, the home element of that is going to be much more teacher-led, is I'm worried that we're asking teachers to deliver the impossible, to both look after a classroom and lead learning at home. And I just really like to understand a bit more detail about what's envisaged, how is that supposed to work, and what additional support, both in terms of either additional people to lead that learning or other resources are required to actually make that work effectively. I'm happy to go to Mr. Thewliss first, given that Mr. Flanagan's had a lot more shots so far.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that, Mr Johnson. I suspect Mr Flanagan will actually have much more to say about this than I've got to say about this. Your point is well made, and it's well understood that we're moving into a system whereby we've got to start school up again. We've got to look at those young people whom we are going to get through the door, and we're going to have a look at the way in which we devise a system which is going to support all young people, both learning in school in a different context and learning out with school in an unknown context. Then there is a workload issue there, and the understanding of what is achievable has got to be clear at the outset of this, and it's got to be based on the most effective way in which we can get young people to learn. So the resource issue is absolutely an issue, in that if we are to make sure that where we are moving from just now, and the system where we have which we have just now, and we'll have through until the summer, will not be the same system as we will have in August. And the notion of what blended learning is going to be is something which has got to be shared with the profession in a certain way as well. Now, I do know coming out of one of the work streams there will be guidance to professionals in relation to what blended learning is. It's not a thing. It's a way of responding to a set of circumstances in which young people will find themselves. And it's very easy to say, okay, blended learning, and just make it the same thing as distance learning and using IT to learn. No, it's not. And the discussions that we've had over the course of the past 8 or 9 weeks have been through discussions related to the kind of hardware which is required, the sort of platform which can deliver blended learning on or distance learning on, and we're now into the discussion round about pedagogy and how the individual pedagogy is working throughout the system can actually start to look at an engagement with young people at a point within their learning, given the circumstances in which their attendance and non-attendance at school between now and getting back to a normality is going to exist, and the way in which we can support that. Now, I understand perhaps I'm not getting to the nub of your question, but it goes without saying, if we're going to do that, we need a resource which is in excess of the resource which we have just now. If we wish to work with every child within Scottish school, all of whose education has been disrupted in and to a certain degree, what we have got to find is the most effective, efficient way of using the resource which we have just now, how to expand and develop that resource, and we've touched on that earlier on within the conversations, but we've also got to make sure that in doing this, we keep our workforce sane and healthy, because if we're in a deficit situation just now, the last thing that we need is the workforce to whom we have got access actually starting to fall off because we're putting far too much pressure on them. People out there understand, to a degree, what is ahead of them. No one is certain as to how that's going to operate, but we do understand it's going to be different. We do understand that what we're going to have to do is operate in a way which is not common to us, but it's important that schools, school leadership, those people out there in the wider community understand and have realistic expectations of what we can do and what the journey back to what normality is going to be, is going to look like, how long it's going to take, and the other things round about this which we're going to have to adjust and change before, at whatever time we get back to that normality, we do it in a way in which young people actually do recover and people out there within the system have a confidence in what education has done and can go forward and do. So it's not just as straightforward as saying, well, we'll drop something called blended learning into the system. Here's what it means to everyone, and that will solve the problem. It's a very, very complex problem, and blended learning in itself is a sophisticated way, and we've got to understand the levels of sophistication that exist within it to be able to engage with young people at the level within their understanding and their progression in learning to make sense of the way forward. Now, that will have different implications for those young people across the system, within broad general education, within senior phase, within those young people who, as we've just discussed, have been disengaged from their learning in the first place. Very complex, very sophisticated. The profession are up for it, but we've got to take very great care of the professionals who are out there and the way in which they will address themselves to this particularly complex, demanding, time-consuming and really quite stressful situation. Sorry, I said that you would say more about than I do. Go on, Larry, beat that.
Well, I'll start by saying I agree with Jim. No, I think the question is well focused, because one of the most popular areas on our website is our advice around teachers' own health and well-being. And even in the working from home scenario, we've had to say to people, you need to stop sometimes and separate out your work life from your actual life. Excessive workload has been an issue for a number of years in schools, and it will be a challenge. There is advice within the Education Recovery Group guidance about the importance of teacher well-being as a prerequisite for pupil well-being in schools, but I think there will be a need for kind of constant reminders around that, because just in a normal situation, being class committed for all your contractual hours, doing your preparation and correction, and then doing all of the additional parental liaison and reporting, it fills the week already before you even start to look at the challenges around blended learning. So we are going to have to have some quite strong parameters around how all this will operate. On a positive, in the survey that we carried out, over 70% of teachers felt that the way the school had delivered home learning had been done in a collaborative and collegiate manner, that they had been involved in the discussions, and that the expectations from both parents and from the school were reasonable. And I think that arises out of having a collegiate approach and having teacher voice in the agency in terms of how things are delivered. So The empowerment agenda which we were engaged in, I think, rather than being parked, still becomes quite critical. That schools and teachers have to feel a level of control over what they're going to cover, as part of the way that they actually have a sense of well-being. So I would hope that the experience has been there for the majority of our members around the lockdown and home learning, around increased collegiality and teacher agency. I would hope that continues into the new arrangement, because that's quite an important mechanism in terms of teachers' sense of well-being.
So my next question actually follows directly on from those comments. I mean, one of the things that I've been struggling with a little bit relates to a sort of fairly fundamental point of pedagogy, in that we have rightly at the heart of Curriculum for Excellence a principle of teacher-led learning. When you look at what has happened over the last couple of months, I think what we've seen in that extraordinary effort from teachers is a lot of material, a lot of content, which essentially teachers have created, by themselves for their pupils, which is absolutely what you'd expect them to do under current practice or pre-existing practice. However, in a home learning situation, both in terms of the timeframes that are required to do it, but also I think the constraints of home learning, trying to deliver something that is consistent and deliverable by parents. I just wonder whether or not actually we need to do something which puts that on its head. And I think this was hinted at by Larry Flanagan in terms of the off-the-shelf content. I mean, do we? So my question is this: I mean, do we need to, at the very least, reassess kind of the E's and O's and benchmarks to ensure that they make sense for a blended learning environment? Do we need to have kind of more off-the-shelf options for teachers to deliver, rather than requiring them to come up with a kind of a brand new set of materials for delivery? And indeed, there's been some calls to actually come up with a sort of for want of a better expression, an emergency curriculum to ensure that there's a degree of consistency. So I would just be interested in Mr. Thewliss's and Mr. Flanagan's kind of thoughts and responses about those points around consistency and curriculum, and what delivering blended learning requires, and what makes it actually easier for teachers to deliver this. I'm happy to go to either one of you first.
Mr. Flanagan, I think first. Yeah.
I've been involved in the work stream looking at curriculum, and it's looking in terms of two phases. So a recovery curriculum, which is if you potentially August to October, that kind of initial phase of people being back in schools, and that's where the very strong focus is on re-engagement, around nurture, around getting young people back into a learning mode. So within that, there's a recommended focus on literacy and numeracy as kind of key starting points. But the discussion was then around, do we need a different curriculum per se? And the consensus was that we didn't, because our curriculum is already founded on kind of nurturing principles. So we do have a active learning approach. We do have engagement with young people. And one of the things that we wanted not to happen was that because of the pressure on time in the classroom, we reverted back to didactic teaching. So, the teacher at the front, delivering the lesson, and the pupils being the recipients. So the positives that we have from Curriculum for Excellence around, the way pupils work in groups, the way teachers interact with the pupils, we don't want to lose that, because that's kind of core to how you actually help nurture and support young people. In any sense, if you go back to didactic teaching, then you have winners and losers in terms of how that operates. So so that there isn't, the consensus is not that we go for a different curriculum. There will be a focus initially around nurture and around literacy and numeracy, but thereafter, we're essentially still looking at the curriculum approach that the CFE envisages. One of the reasons for the unified August 11th start date was so that what was being offered by Education Scotland had a kind of time frame to it that was common across all schools. So there is going to be some attempt, probably applies more in the secondary, around course content so that it matches where schools would be in terms of their progression. So that off the shelf kind of works because it's matching what you're doing in schools. The really big challenge, I hesitate to bring it up, will be around senior phase and SQA, because there are parameters there in operation, around awards, which aren't there across the rest of the 3 to 15. I think it is useful that the government have said that they're not going to be collecting the curriculum for excellence levels, and assessment in the first initial period is going to be assessment of children's needs, rather than assessment as an attainment mark. I think that's a useful signal to the priorities that we're looking for around young people's well-being in the first instance. But I think the further we go into the year, there'll have to be further developed thinking around, if we're still in a physical distancing scenario come November, December, and it's going to be there for a foreseeable time, then there'll be a kind of ongoing review around the curriculum offer and how it's working, because we may have to adapt given circumstances.
Thank you.
Mr. Thewliss?
Thank you. To come back to one of the phrases that Mr. Johnston used, he talked about the possibility of an emergency curriculum. I would like to suggest that we're not going to go anywhere near that. And a recovery curriculum, as Larry has talked about, is not an emergency curriculum. A recovery curriculum is to bring us back to the consistency which Mr. Johnston is suggesting that we have lost that wee bit. The recovery curriculum will take us back to curriculum for excellence, and the consistency and the national approach which curriculum for excellence provides to the system. It's very useful to have one or two distractions removed along the way. The removal of the need for a CFE level reporting and things like that. It's been very useful within the discussions that KERC has had round about the way in which we can actually implement a recovery curriculum in such a way that it brings us back to what a normality will be, as and when that normality does come into play. Two kind of key bits to this, and the first bit is the impact and the influence which Education Scotland is having and can have in relation to the way in which it supports that journey and supports the profession within that journey. And the second is to get out into the system, and I think it was Workstream 1 has produced a definition and a kind of guide to what a blended learning is. So those two key things together, working within a recovery curriculum, will take us to a place sometime after August, where we then start to look at, certainly within broad general education, a refocusing of the system and young people finding themselves within that system at a level within their learning progression, which is consistent with recovery and then progression. Larry's points in relation to SQA and senior phase and qualifications are points well made. They are points of active discussion within curriculum and assessment, within education recovery group just now. That's something which the future will determine the way in which we move with that, but it is a source of active discussion just now.
Thank you.
Thank you. I was going to ask a third question, but convener, in the interest of time, I recognise we're only halfway through, so I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's very welcome, Mr. Johnston. I was just going to say that half the committee haven't had a question yet, and we've been taking up some time. So if people could be generous and giving up opportunities and succinct answers, very helpful as well. I'll move to Mr. Neil.
Okay, thank you, convener. Can I begin by raising the practical issues that have arisen during home learning and also which will have an impact on the success or otherwise of blended learning? particularly in relation to IT infrastructure. A lot of parents and pupils and teachers tell me that even where the pupils have got the latest technology, or the teachers have the latest technology at home, the lack of an IT support infrastructure. So somebody has a problem at home, whether it's a teacher or a pupil, there's nobody there to sort it. There's no service in many areas to sort it. So is there provision for that kind of service in future? There's a report out this morning from Edinburgh University's School of Political and Social Science, and one of their recommendations is that there should be an online IT infrastructure centralised and run nationally. Would you both agree with that?
Mr. Thewliss?
The straightforward answer to that is yes, I think that I would agree with that, in that we have found out an awful lot over the course of the past 12 weeks in relation to the way in which we can support or not to support distance learning. And once we start to unravel this, we will find ourselves, I would suggest, in a much stronger position in relation to the way in which we look at that kind of aspect of learning. We will be in this position for a while. We have developed a significant way from where we were 8 to 10 weeks ago. It would be reasonable and sensible to assume that suggestions such as the one which have come out of Edinburgh University this morning are going to add to that discussion and debate in a very, very positive way. We're finding things out. Once we've had time to kind of recap, reflect, I would suspect that we're going to be in a much, much stronger position in relation to education of young people across the board. And going forward from that, the way in which we actually expand and develop learning in a way which we kind of thought we could do up until this point, but necessity has been the mother of invention and put us into a place where perhaps we could do things an awful lot better than we have been doing. So your points are well made. At the moment, we're still finding our way through that. At some point, once we've actually got young people back to where we feel they should be in relation to their education progress, sometime round about that, we start to reflect on the good things that will have come out of this.
Mr. Flanagan?
Well, I think the issue of digital inequity has certainly been shown up by the lockdown experience, and we know there are challenges. For example, if there are 2 or 3 children in a household and there's one laptop, then there has to be a rota around usage. We did a survey, not to do with schools, but to do with colleges, and lots of college students could only access through a mobile phone because they didn't have the kind of Wi-Fi support at home that would allow them to access the college platform. So there are, I think, huge issues within that. If you have to buy a dongle to get Wi-Fi access, it's very expensive. So I think I haven't seen the Edinburgh report, but I think there does need to be a review around how we address that inequity. In terms of a national system, I would have thought that GLOW was meant to be that. So GLOW's system operates across all schools. It's had a checkered history, but it seems to be at a stage now where it is being used much more effectively. It's certainly going to be the platform that Education Scotland are using going forward in relation to its blended learning offer. So it might be that, rather than reinventing the wheel, we look to see what additionality is required around GLOW to make it as interactive as possible and user-friendly as possible. Behind that, we saw with Jim this morning, even when you've got the technology, you sometimes need somebody to troubleshoot it for you to resolve it. So I think that kind of technical backup would be important also. We've got some experience around eSchool, in the Western Isles, where they've been using online platforms. So I think that's probably an area for future development, but clearly quite critical to blended learning approaches.
I mean, the kind of examples I've had is very similar to Jim's experience this morning, where there's maybe nothing wrong with his computer system, but he required the support of IT to get it sorted. And obviously that's happening on a regular basis just with homeworking, let alone going to the blended teaching. Can I ask a related question? The government's announced £9 million to help poorer children get laptops and so on. In some cases, that will also, in my view, have to pay for connections to the internet and basic servicing, as well as the hardware of a laptop or whatever. Can I ask you, in your own experience and from what we've known from the experience of the last 10 weeks or so, is £9 million, how many children do you think would benefit from that? Seems to me that it's an area where additional funding is going to be required for the poorer students, because I don't see £9 million filling the gap. What's your experience?
I thought the figure was 30 million. But if you're asking me, do we need more money, then the answer is yes.
I think, Larry, my question is, obviously everybody says they need more money. We need more money. But my answer is, what's the scale? What's the size of this problem? From the survey work that you've done in the EIS, for example, how many children do you think today, out of the million or so kids, how many of them have no access to a computer or the technology that goes with it, would you reckon?
Well, in the survey, 54% of teachers said that lack of internet access was the key issue around engaging young people in terms of lockdown. So, we had 26,000 teachers responded to the survey. So, I would do a kind of estimate from that, but it's certainly not an insignificant problem. And possibly part of what we have to do around an equity audit is actually to crunch some of those numbers so that, we're not dealing anecdotally with the challenge, but we're actually looking at a kind of checklist around, well, as a young person in this school, do you have access to, will you be able to connect to, and then address that. I think that the money that's been announced is going to local authorities and then essentially going through the schools. So schools, a bit like the PEF money, schools will be best placed to address that on a kind of pupil by pupil basis. And clearly, some local authorities will have a bigger demand than others. Highland already have extensive IT platforms in use for their schools and have issued pupils with equipment, all pupils with equipment. Glasgow is doing a rollout of iPads to all pupils, so that there's a bit of work being done around trying to make sure that there isn't digital inequity in play. But we probably, I don't know, I certainly don't have figures that I could present to you just now, Ali, but I think probably as an area that we need to kind of actually look at what is the specific demand and then quantify what the ask is in terms of addressing that.
But even if it's anywhere near 54%, even if it's half that, if blended learning is going to work, a prerequisite is that poor kids have the same opportunities and same access to computer equipment as middle class kids from better off backgrounds. And clearly it seems to me that this is a major area and a top priority. I mean, we don't have a long time between now and the 11th of August to try and close that gap.
Well, I think both Jim and I would absolutely agree with that. I think that I have to address that. Otherwise, blended learning gets off to a poor start.
Jim, did you want to come back in on that? Jim?
Yeah. Briefly, and there's kind of 2 points here, and it's part of the discussion we've already had, and it's in relation to the kind of short-term issues in getting us through this. And the points that you make, Alec, are absolutely well made in relation to equity and the disadvantage that certain groups of young people are going to face. In the longer term, we get through this and looking at equity and equity within learning, equity within Scottish society, there's a much greater discussion that needs to take place in relation to the way in which we address that. Now, one of the greatest ways in which equity has been addressed in Scottish society is through the baby box. Can we start to look at the expansion of digital awareness, digital support, in the same sort of context as we have done that? It's not beyond the wit of man to start to say, you know, Glasgow can roll out iPads to kids within schools within Glasgow. Can we, as a national government, start to look at the way in which we take that forward across the school estate, to enable young people to engage with learning in a manner which is more than just, you know, getting yourself into the school building. Learn from what we've done just now, start to invest for a future, going forward in a way in which the good lessons in relation to learning, blended learning, distance learning, home-based learning, parentally supported learning, can be taken forward in a digital context, and it's the same way as it can be taken forward in other contexts. Look at it in a way in which we can learn from what we have found ourselves in, not taking away from the notion that if £30 million is there in the short term, find us some more and we'll do better things with it, and then show you good practice when we want to start talking about what we look at in the far future.
Okay, that's very helpful.
Mr. Neil?
In the interest of time, I'll roll my final three questions into one shorter question. And again, and I fully appreciate this is a report that just out this morning from Edinburgh University, but it very clearly shows that the issue of the educational attainment gap has got worse during the lockdown, is going to get even warmer months, and will require very special policy prescriptions to arrest it and to try to recover some of the lost ground. Three of the specific recommendations are that disadvantaged children should be offered catch-up classes during the summer. They should also be offered one-to-one or small group tuition over and above timetable teaching time when school returns. And the other recommendation is the exam diet of 2021 should be cancelled, and a move to a model of teacher judgment and continuous assessment should be made. Can I ask your kind of general thoughts on those kind of recommendations? Will they help?
Go to Larry first.
Yeah, I think on the first one, local authorities are looking at a level of summer provision, but it's not so much catch-up classes as, you know, essentially engaging young people in activities. So it's a more a nurturing approach than a kind of academic drive. And to be honest, I actually think that's most appropriate. I think, you know, following lockdown, getting young people to mix together again, to play together, is probably as important as looking to the educational challenges that will still be there come August. I agree with the second point. You know, we're advocating the same, that for those who are most disadvantaged, something like a one-to-one mentoring system is potentially the most effective way of providing that additionality that will be required. And on the SQA, we certainly think that teachers' professional judgment should be central to accreditation. There are discussions going on at the moment. There are big challenges around that. I think we're looking at what has to be done immediately in order to future-proof next year's accreditation against further impact from COVID-19, a further lockdown, or you know, diet being cancelled. We have a very strong view that we should be looking at exit qualifications to allow more teaching time for deeper learning. But whether what happens next year is exactly what's going to happen in the future, or just a precursor, thing still remains for discussion. I am totally comfortable with the idea of professional judgment centre stage and continuous assessment being a norm, but a lot of teachers, a lot of parents, you know, like the exam diet. It's a traditional experience, so there's a big communication issue there around any changes. I think both Jim and I are clear that we do actually want to minimise change because staff and schools are going to be coping with enough, as our students. without too much adjustment to accreditation. I do think this year's diet will affect, or this year's qualifications will turn out okay, because I think professional judgment will be a good yardstick by which accreditation is achieved.
Mr. Thewliss?
Yes, Alex, to come to the three things that you pick up. Number one and number two are additionality into the system, and it's kind of sheer common sense that you start to look at that in a way in which you can support those young people who are potentially disadvantaged. The third part round about exams and the way in which we look at exams, the discussion, there was a discussion beginning to gain a bit of traction on that before we get into the COVID emergency. I'm perfectly confident in echoing what Larry has said in relation to what we're going to find coming from teacher judgment related to the exam results come August of this year. I think the profession has done absolutely superbly in the way in which it has responded to an emergency which was thrust upon it over the course of about 10 days. I think the profession will actually come out of this enhanced in relation to the way in which it has done that. I think, kind of harking back in parts of a conversation we had in relation to other things earlier on, it is now worthy of a discussion to start looking longer term as to whether the way in which we conduct an exam diet, and have done, is the way in which you should be doing that within the 21st century. That's for another argument for another day, and certainly would be well up for having that discussion. My views are very similar to Larry's views within this one, in the way in which we promote learning, as opposed to have a system which is kind of stops everything at Christmas for prelim exams and no learning takes place, and stops everything in May for 3 or 4 weeks for exams when no learning takes place. But that's a discussion for another time and another place, which I would be more than up for having, because I think we can do things much, much better in relation to the way in which learning is conducted and the way in which we actually do assess the attainment that young people make in their learning journey. For another time, though.
Thank you.
Thank you
can I move to Mr. Halcrow-Johnson? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, Jim and Larry. I'd like to go back to the digital side. I know it's an area that's been covered, but I have, over the last weeks, months, asked repeatedly through ministerial or in response to ministerial statements, oral questions, written parliamentary questions, for a figure for the number of young people who did not have access to the required technology, whether that's the hardware or whether that's broadband. And the answer that I got from the government again and again was that they didn't know, and this was an issue for local authorities. This was an area of responsibilities for local authorities. Now, listening to Radio Scotland this morning, Aileen Pryor of Connect said she knew of at least one school in Edinburgh that had 20% of young people who didn't have access. If that was across the whole of the country, and it may be that isn't reflected across the country, but it could be worse in some areas and better in others, that would be a considerable number of young people without the access, far more than the 25,000 laptops that have been put forward. So I've been surprised that the Scottish Government hasn't known. Do you not think that this is something that they should have done the work on to get an idea of the number of children that have been missing out so far?
Go to Mr. Thewliss first.
The answer to your question is not quite as straightforward as perhaps it would seem. There are a whole series of things which, where we are within the situation we are just now, it would be great to have said, we should have found this out earlier on. We should have understood about this earlier on. We are in a position now where we are finding out things which would have been useful to know, and in the future, it's certainly important that we do know. It's a question which perhaps has got to be asked, but asked in a more sophisticated way than perhaps they are suggesting. And it's not just the number of young people who do not have access to a laptop. The number of people who do not have access to a laptop within a household where there's all sorts of other things going on, where there's no internet access. Start asking these questions now and start to understand in the future how we actually develop learning within a digital context, because we have found out things now which would be useful to take that forward. Understand why you're asking the question. To find an answer out at the minute, I don't think it's going to take the discussion much further forward just now. We find our way through, do what we can do, reflect on what we've learned from it, and move forward in a positive way.
Sorry, can I just come back in there? Can I come in very quickly, just on that point, Convener? If we can't ask the questions now, and this will be reflective of the issue for the last month or 2 months, is anybody going to respond in terms of policy of providing, as I say, laptops? Surely we've got to have an idea now of what the problem is, so that by the 11th of August, when blended learning comes in and schools return under blended learning, we have an idea of the needs of young people. And you're absolutely right in regards to broadband. That was part of the questions that I've asked. And I can assure you, I've written to the directors of education of all councils. I've had councils come back to me with these figures actually fairly quickly in some cases. So it's not as though that information wasn't available, or an estimate of that information wasn't available. And I'm struggling to understand why the Scottish Government couldn't do the same and get that information and make it available to us so that they can be involved in that planning going forward.
I can't answer on behalf of Scottish Government, but the information which we get just now will reflect the response which we can make just now. There are certain responses going on. I think that between now and August we can respond to that in a much more sophisticated and detailed way. Take the opportunity, however, to deal with the situation as far as we can deal with the situation just now, and I think what I'm saying is sometime in the future start to look at it in a more sophisticated way than just sort of stemming the dam as we're doing just now.
Mr. Flanagan?
The EIS published about 18 months ago a document called Poverty Proofing Our Schools, and we are actually developing at the moment with Education Scotland a project, a training project around the same concept. And within that, one of the things we were saying to teachers is do not assume that children have certain things as a norm, and digital access was one of the areas, because schools have started to develop a lot of online digital homework, and we had to say, you may actually be building in a barrier here for young people whose lives are blighted by poverty. So the issue of the digital inequity has been kind of there for a while, and I think the committee is right to highlight it. I spoke at a housing association in Glasgow not that long ago, and they had done a survey of their tenants, and under half of the tenants had laptops. Now, I happen to know which school served that catchment area, and it would probably have been a surprise to the school to find so many children came from backgrounds where that access wasn't available, because other parts of the catchment area were relatively affluent. So I do think there is a need as part of the equity audit to actually make an assessment around this. Some councils will probably have it if they have a digital strategy whereby they're supplying equipment already, so that it's kind of ready-made calculation in Glasgow, for example, because they're rolling out the iPads. I think probably it's an area where schools would be best placed to kind of interrogate that a little bit. But I would also just say, so I think going forward, whether we have the figures or not now, I think forward we need to make an assessment of that as part of our approach. But also there was an OECD report last week, and although we're concentrating here on digital access, there are still tens of thousands of pupils who don't have a table to work at in terms of doing homework. The digital aspect is simply one part of the poverty that they're suffering from. So they don't have safe spaces or isolated spaces to do homework. They're working in households with limited accommodation. So there's much more than just the digital aspect around addressing the impact of poverty on young people's chances. I think digital is important because it's going to be part of the platform, but we should look beyond that as well in terms of the equity audit.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think you made the point as well earlier, Larry, that it's also supporting parents as well with their learning at home. It's not just that technical side. I was just going to ask as well. I know that there are schools within my region, the Highlands and Islands, that are obviously having to go in, print off huge amounts of information to send out paper and physical content as well. Is there more? I think we've touched on it, but is there more that the Scottish Government can do to help support that, or that you're aware of that they are doing to support that? Because obviously that's a large commitment from individual schools and individual teachers, and it kind of touches on the point that I think Daniel Johnson mentioned earlier about that. So that actual physical support, perhaps particularly for maybe primary school children.
Yeah. Mr. Flanagan?
Well, I'll probably just revisit my earlier answer, because I think there is an additional resource demand around how schools are coping with lockdown and how they will cope with blended learning come August, hopefully. But the within each council, there's an internal battle around resources with different departments, also looking for additional resource to deal with COVID. So those discussions that are taking place between COS and Scottish Government, I think, are around finance, are quite critical to the ability of councils to enable schools to address this. The PEF funding is there. The rules have been relaxed to allow it to be used to be part of the response to COVID-19. So that's welcome. But the demands just keep growing, so there's a real pressure around additional resource. I have some sympathy with COSLA on the broader issue, but I'm also keen that education has some priority within COSLA's thinking, because we have in the past had to see ring fencing around education budgets to make sure that they're spent where they were targeted. So without wanting to get embroiled in the COSLA Scottish Government discussion, additional resource is certainly a requirement.
Mr. Thewliss?
Yeah, just to add to that, the notion of resource is an issue. Of course it's an issue. But one of the things that has developed over the course of the past kind of 2 to 3 years is the whole kind of empowerment agenda, and the way in which schools have shown themselves very, very adept to responding to identified issues within their own particular catchment and their school community. And the whole discussion round about empowerment has been supported at school level, but the way in which PEF money has been able to be seen to be used in a manner which actually does target and does focus on the specific areas within a school. Other part to this is, and it's perhaps a wee bit wider than perhaps you were suggesting in the first place, and not just related to the fact that we've got to send newsletters and whatever else out to parents. One of the discussions we've been having with School Leaders Scotland members at the moment is the way and the level of communication which you have with parents, and the way in which you start to engage with not just the whole parental body, but the parental body in a way which is actually meaningful to them within the context of their own child. Now, whether that's electronically, whether it's by telephone, whether it's by letter, whether it's by actually going out and knocking up their door, the whole concept of communication at a point such as we are at just now is absolutely critical to perhaps everything else which we've discussed this morning in relation to the way in which we re-engage young people with their learning and we bring families into the learning context. So again, it's not just a matter of the money associated with how you communicate, whether it be electronically, whether it be by paper. It's actually the whole notion about what you understand about communication and what communication means to the people with whom you're trying to communicate, not you as the communicator. And that has been something which we've pushed to head teachers regularly over the course of the past 2 months or so. Find ways. Don't depend on just one method, and don't believe that because you do it, the people whom you're aiming at are actually going to pick it up. So it's another aspect to your question.
Thank you both for those answers.
Are you finished, Mr. Halker-Johnson? Yeah.
Sorry, I am, yes, conscious of time. So.
Yeah. No, that's fine. Yeah, I'm going to bring in Ms. Mackay. Thanks.
Thanks, convener, and good morning, Larry and Jim. The EIS submission talks about specific challenges around pupils with additional support needs, such as physical distancing when they're struggling with conditions. I have 2 excellent ESN schools in my constituency. Can I ask if you believe there's enough support and guidelines for teachers dealing with children with ESN needs, and what options there are to do more? Should the guidelines come from local authorities? Should there be national guidelines? And if you could just clarify an earlier point about PPE, should that be sourced from the local authorities or elsewhere?
Go to Mr. Thewliss first.
Yep. Had you asked me that question 8 or 9 weeks ago, you would have got a much more robust answer, I suppose, than you're going to get this morning. And that things have moved on. But in relation to the way in which we engage within the current circumstances with young people, with ESN young people, there has been challenges. There were challenges early on in relation to PPE, in relation to distancing, in relation, I've got to say, to the level of information and the level of understanding of that information in the early days. The experience which has come through the hubs is that we have learned quickly and learned quite substantially, and are in a much better position now to start moving forward in relation to the way in which we come out of lockdown within the educational circumstance, both now and certainly when we come to August. So not yet in the best position, but certainly in a much better position than we were 8 to 10 weeks ago. And the debate over funding in relation to this and everything else between COSLA and Scottish Government lies very much at the heart of the questions which you're asking.
Mr. Flanagan?
Yeah, I think additional support needs is there's a huge range of need within that. Most of the discussion, I think, is focused around quite specialist provision in terms of SEN schools rather than additional support needs support in mainstream schools. The issue there, I think, as Jim alluded to, I think in the hub provision it's been maintained for a fairly limited number of students, but where it's been maintained, then there is now quite detailed guidance around operational guidance around providing that support, and that's where there was an agreement that the PPE equipment would be made available for staff to deploy in situations, and you can be talking about people with very specialist needs in that area, and close proximity is a requirement. I'm not actually sure, what the source of the PPE equipment is, to be honest, whether it's been NHS or the local authority. Certainly in the specialist needs schools, the equipment has been provided after some initial discussion around its value, and that would need to be maintained going forward. So we're basically talking here about pupils for whom the 2 metre physical distancing can't work in terms of addressing their needs. I think more generally there are a lot of people who are in special provision who've got emotional and behavioural needs. In the survey, in terms of ESN hubs, it was the emotional needs of young people that staff found hardest to address because they were in a stressful situation, because it was a different scenario from norm, and that is where you need that is just where you need the teacher, the staff. You need people to be able to actually spend time with the young people and talk them through into a more comfortable space. I think we probably can apply some, as Jim said, there's some good learning from the hub experience around SEN schools taking back a larger role, pupil role, because not all the SN pupils had to attend the hubs. Some of them were looked after at home by parents or carers. But I think we're as well placed as we can be now, looking ahead to August in relation to continuing that provision.
Ms Mackay?
Yes, thank you for that. My final question relates to something touched on earlier by Beatrice Wishart, and it's about the rising number of children experiencing domestic abuse during lockdown. Submissions from Scottish Women's Aid, Children's First, Aberlour and many others feel that there needs to be a more coordinated approach to keeping children safe during this time, and that the definition of vulnerable should include domestic children experiencing domestic abuse. They believe these children should have priority access to learning in hubs and local authorities, and they're suggesting that this could be done in conjunction with their organisations through the referral pathways. I just wonder if I could have your view on that, please. Do you think there is enough interaction going on between organisations who deal with this day in, day out, and to help at this particularly concerning time?
Mr. Thewliss?
Yeah, I think there is a level of interaction. There always has been a level of interaction between organisations and schools, taking it through the whole notion of getting it right for every child and the way in which that's taken forward within schools. The situation has changed and the situation has shifted, I think, as I mentioned earlier on, over the course of the past 12 weeks or so. And we have all got to be more highly attuned and more highly receptive to the sort of signs which young people are going to exhibit when they come to schools. That being the case, the kind of protocols which we have and the levels of interaction which we have, which vary across the country, are something which we're going to actually up the game on. We must up the game on, because it's not something that schools, through their own systems, are going to be able to deal with most effectively. The level of support and the level of backup that we're going to need to be able to do this is something which we can access if we get the systems, I think, as you're suggesting, right, and if we access the right people at the right time. Point well made, and are attuned to that.
Thank you.
Mr. Flanagan?
Our Equalities Department has actually been doing a lot of work around the issue of domestic abuse, so I think we're certainly networked into a number of bodies who are campaigning around this, and as a predominantly female profession, we have also been making sure that our members are aware of how to deal with domestic abuse if they experience it in terms of their own situation. So I do accept the point that we need to have interagency working around this, because undoubtedly there's been an increased incidence of domestic abuse during the lockdown period, and probably amongst the families that schools have found it most difficult to keep in contact with. So yeah. I know a lot of work has been done by pastoral care staff in the secondary sector and by promoted staff in the primary sector. But again, the survey indicated that there is a significant number of pupils with whom contact has not been maintained. So there is a big concern there around the potential impact of that on young people. And I think there is an attempt across June for schools to try and re-engage as many vulnerable young people as possible as part of the preparation for August. As I said earlier, I'm not convinced that we'll make a lot of progress on that in the next couple of weeks, but I think it will be a priority for schools when they restart to make sure that these young people are brought back into a nurturing environment, and if there is trauma to be addressed, that we have the resource to do that.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in, and it may be by voice only, Dr. Allen.
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me.
We can.
Good. It's a question, I think, for Mr. Flanagan, who touched already on the question of the senior phase and on the exams. We've heard in this committee already from the SQA and their take on this year's diet of qualifications rather than exams. It would be good to hear the teacher's perspective, and particularly about the issue of estimation, and whether Mr Flanagan feels there's been enough clarity and information about what's being asked of teachers this year.
I think where we are now in the system, and all the estimates are in, so I think we are in a good place in terms of accreditation. We certainly had a lot of feedback over the course around essentially what was regarded as poor communication from SQA. We've had a lot of dialogue with the SQA, and both Jim and I are on the SQA contingency group. So I wouldn't say that we haven't had the discussions, but we put out, the EIS put out to our own members, what I consider to be a more detailed explanation of what was happening than SQA put out. So I think there have been some challenges around SQA communications. They are relying on professional judgment, but at times it felt as if they were only doing it because they had no other choice. I think they could have embraced it a bit more positively. I actually think estimates are straightforward. I wasn't convinced that ranking was a requirement. At one stage I thought it was becoming overly complex, but we have, we've got through it, and I know, and I'm sure Jim will testify to this as well, that there's been an absolutely huge effort on the part of secondary teachers to get this right for young people. The estimates have been poured over in departments and in schools with the local authority oversight, so I think young people can have some confidence in the outcome. The one area that's maybe still up for discussion in relation to SQA is statistical moderation of the estimates. We've been clear in saying to SQA that it should not allow a computer model to overturn professional judgment. If the statistical modelling throws up what appears to be a discrepancy, then there should be a professional dialogue between SQA and the presenting centre to find out the reasons for it, and hopefully for then an agreed outcome to emerge. Because if we get to a place come August where significant number of schools have seen their estimates overturned, that will just generate a whole raft of appeals. And if that's on a significant scale, it will undermine the process. So I really think it's critical that some professional dialogue between now that the estimates are in and August the 4th, I think it is, when they're published, it should take place so that there is a kind of a confidence that the published results are a fair reflection of what students have rightly achieved on the back of the year's study.
Thank you. Mr Thewliss, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah. Yes, a couple of points. The first is to run it back when the decision was made to take the exams out of the system. And what the estimates and the process around the estimates has revealed over the course of that kind of 8 to 9 weeks is how robust the assessment system within schools actually is. And I think we're moving at a degree of confidence on the professional judgment which has been shown by teachers in relation to young people's achievement and the way in which that will be reflected in the awards and the grades come August. The point round about communication is a point well made, in that we also, in relation to the way in which SQA communications came out, had to spend bits of time reflecting upon that and informing colleagues just exactly what this means in relation to what happens within your school. Being on the contingency group and sort of transmitting that information into the contingency group has been fine. And the way in which it has moved forward has been a positive way forward, in that the response by SQA in relation to the criticism of our communications has been a good response, and credit where credit is due, I suppose. Coming to the latter part, and Larry picked up on to professional judgment and the way in which schools have conducted the way through this process. Communication means dialogue. Communication does not mean information related to something conducted against a statistical model. Conduct a dialogue, take that discussion forward within the context of what teachers and their understanding of a child's learning has been, and then, if you're going to adjust grades, look at it in that sort of a way. There's still, the time is available to do that, and it would be time well spent, because if you do not do that, and then you start to have a plethora of appeals, then all that does is distract in August from the work which teachers need to be doing in August, because it will be teachers who will deal with the appeals process. Take time to do that aforesaid, and then you start to look at the way in which the system can move forward with a confidence and with an understanding that what the teachers have said actually does reflect their professional judgment in a way which is sustainable moving forward.
Dr. Allen?
Yeah, coming back on what was said there by Mr. Thewliss, can I take from what he's just said there that he's anticipating an increased number of appeals this year?
I don't know whether I'm clever enough to answer that question, Alistair. There is that potential there. If we do not get it right between now and August, that potential is there. And I think what both Larry and I have said is, if there is an issue within the SQA over the estimates that have been put there by teachers, start to talk to us about it. Don't just apply a modelling exercise and take it forward from there. Talk to us now.
Dr. Allen?
That's my final question, I think, in the interest of time, I think.
Thank you. I do appreciate that, and I do appreciate everyone bearing with the committee today. I'll go to Mr. Greer.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to stick with this theme of this year's alternative to the exam diet. A couple of questions around the process on it. You might be aware that the Equality and Human Rights Commissioners raised some concerns about whether the SQA are meeting their legal duties under the Equality Act. The SQA have now committed to this committee that they will obviously conduct an equality impact assessment, but they'll publish it as well. They've not committed as to when they'll actually publish it. And they have confirmed to us that they won't publish the methodology of their moderation system until the results are released in August. So if you can forgive me for rolling a couple of questions into one for the sake of time here. I'm wondering if the SQA have shared enough information with you about what they're doing around equalities for you to be confident that they've followed the right process. Do you have any views on when their equality impact assessment should be published? And do you agree with them? Do you agree with their withholding of the methodology for the moderation system until after the results are issued?
Mr. Flanagan?
Yeah, in terms of they haven't really shared the statistical modelling detail, but both, I think Jim and I have both been, well, I've certainly been a SQA examiner, so it doesn't take much to work out what the modelling is actually going to be. The issue is around the weightings within that. So ranking, for example, used to be a familiar part of the estimates process, and it was there to avoid unnecessary appeals. So it kind of corrected things in advance. Where I think, I think they should. I'm quite happy for them to share it. I'm not sure it will cast much light. I think the bigger issue is how they apply it. Because the equity issue that's come up most, Ross, in the discussions, is that students from disadvantaged backgrounds are more likely to be at the borderlines, the thresholds of some of the grade passes. And if SQA uses statistical modelling to essentially create a grade boundary, even although there's no exam, those who would be most disadvantaged would be those who just miss out on the grade boundary. Now, our argument is you can't establish grade boundaries based on statistical modelling. If your modelling shows that in a particular school or a particular department that the estimates appear to be either stronger or weaker than the modelling would have suggested, what you need to do is you need to speak to that department and ask the reasons, because there may well be reasons. Right? It may be that last year they didn't have 2 maths teachers and this year they do have them. So the course has been delivered more effectively. So, it's back to the point, the way you avoid inequity being built into the system is you make sure you're actually having a professional dialogue before you finalise results. I am concerned that if they don't have that dialogue, then the modelling will disadvantage some young people, and just based upon working knowledge of the students who are going to be on the thresholds, that will contain a significant number of young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. So there is a concern around that, but there is a solution to it, which is to make sure that professional dialogue takes place. I'm not exactly sure why they're not willing to explain the mechanics of their modelling. You're not going to see the result of it until the results are released, but the basic modelling behind it, if the SAGE group can explain how they get to the R figure, I'm pretty sure SQA can explain how the modelling works. So I'd be happy to see that published, as I think would most of the profession, because we were certainly saying to SQA, the more people understand the process, the more chance there is of it being effective. So I'm not totally on board with SQA's reluctance to share that information.
Mr. Thewliss?
Quickly.
Can we ask Mr. Thewliss? Oh, yes. Quick intervention, Ross.
Yeah, it's just to quickly follow something specific up with Larry before allowing Jim to answer more broadly. You mentioned the issue that the weightings being the key part of the methodology that is the unknown. Do you have any understanding of the relative weighting being given to, for example, the rankings where there's been this question of false precision or the use of school level historical data? Have the SQA communicated to you the relative weightings that these data sources are going to be given?
Well, the short answer is no. So we know they're all part of the mix, but we don't know what the balance between them is. I'm not sure that I maybe misled you by saying weightings in the sense of, I think it's iterations of a process rather than specific weightings. But again, I'm guessing that really, Ross, because they haven't shared that with any of us, I don't think.
Mr. Thewliss?
Thanks.
Yeah. To emphasise one or two things that Larry has said, they haven't shared an awful lot with us. Having been in the game for a long, long time, it's reasonable enough to be able to work out what they're doing. So I can't understand why they're not prepared to share the process. I don't think it would do them any harm. I don't think it would do the system any harm to do that. That's just an aside to it. The other part related to the young people who find themselves at the cusp between grades. If you kind of run it back a wee bit to the beginning of the discussion in relation to teacher estimates, the whole notion of inferred attainment and the kind of knowledge that the teachers had of young people and the way in which they learned and the way in which they progressed through their learning was kind of raised as something which schools should be using in relation to the way in which they put their estimates together. And it seems a wee bit kind of strange to me that if you start that, if you put that in at the beginning of the process and say inferred attainment is something which you should be looking at, and then apply a statistical model at the end of the process, they seem to kind of run counter to one another. Hence, the whole notion of saying, okay, and fair attainment at the start, we perhaps have an issue with you at the end process in relation to this grade, have a conversation with us. And that, at that point, the explanation of what inferred attainment has meant in relation to this candidate becomes clear, sustainable or unsustainable. And that puts a certain logic and understanding to why the grade that the young person has got at the end actually is that grade and not what the school has put in its estimate in the first place. That's open, it's transparent, it's understandable, and it enables the school going on forward from that to actually explain.
Thank you, Mr. Greer.
Thank you. Yeah, just one final question in that case around next year's exams. The EIS have already, I believe, put statements out calling for continuous assessment to be used, I think, for National 5 and hires in particular, rather than end-of-year exams, because of the impact that blended learning is going to have, as we discussed earlier, and also the uncertainty as to what a second wave of the virus might result in, whether or not those end-of-year exams are potentially cancelled in the way that this year's are. So if I could just ask, given that the SQA have said they are intending to run exams as normal next year, what do you believe the consequences would be, particularly on the attainment gap, of running a normal exam diet in 2021 after an unpredictable period of time of blended learning leading up to it?
I think the SQA have said that they are planning for a diet, and that's a kind of holding position, because they would be planning for the diet in the normal course of things. I think they are still awaiting an actual decision around what's going to happen. I mean, you touched on the issue, Ross, because if you have a 160 hours course, even if you take the 40 hours out for consolidation, if you've 120 hours to run your course, and you know that pupils aren't going to get that amount of teaching, is it fair then to present them with an exam based upon 120 hours learning? How can schools deliver 120 hours learning? Well, the only way they could do it is by basically keeping S1, 2 and 3 at home for the year. So you might be able to prioritise a little bit, but we're up against it in terms of the time that's available. And where the discussion is at the moment is how you try to reconcile, those two irreconcilable objectives. So, without breaching the confidence of discussions, the SQA are looking at their current system and saying the best way they can ensure integrity is to maintain their current arrangements. And others are saying, well, we can't deliver the teaching and learning for that, so something's going to have to change. There is discussion around S4 pupils only using unit accreditation and looking at an exit qualification. That creates 10 to 12 weeks additional teaching time for S4. 90% of those pupils go into S5 anyway and can progress on to the next step. Those who leave school, most leave to go into college or apprenticeships, so the unit certification will articulate with that. So, so that's been looked at in terms of S4. That's certainly what the EIS are advocating. But still leaves you a challenge in terms of S5, S6 with students who are going to be leaving. I don't think it's good enough just to say, let's hope that physical distancing eases off at some point and we get more teaching time. I think we have to plan for the worst. And that could be a disruption to actual teaching and learning. I mean, this year the diet was cancelled at the end of the courses, so the courses have been delivered. If we have to have a school lockdown in January, we're losing teaching time. So I think we need to have something that kind of future-proofs the accreditation, and the use of professional judgment. I think is a key fallback in that system. The debate is whether you work towards a diet or you work towards, or you have a continuous assessment approach. The one thing I'd finish on is I think a decision on that has to be made quite soon, because pupils are already in senior phase classes and teachers are delivering coursework based upon existing courses. So we don't want to be wasting time, and we do need to know what's going to be happening so that we can plan for next year.
Mr. Thewliss?
Yeah, my views on this one are exactly the same as Larry's views on this one. It would be reasonable to expect an organisation such as SQA to have a plan for the future. Given that none of us knows what the future is, none of us knows exactly what will happen in August when young people come back to school. The decision is a decision that's got to be made quickly. If it just gets made quickly, it then allows the system to start working to support young people to get the best from the system which you're going to put into place. We were very fortunate this year in that when we decided to pull the exam diet, most of the work had been done. We don't want to be in that position again. If we plan for a future where young people and their parents and the schools understand what that future is going to lead to within the context of a year within a school life, then we're going to be in a much, much better position to support all young people within the system. And you touched on the attainment gap, Ross. It is a point well made. We support everyone within the system if there's a certainty there. We put everyone in the system at a disadvantage if there's an uncertainty there.
Mr. Greene? Can we have Mr. Greene's microphone on? Thank you.
Thank you. I was waiting patiently there for the microphone. This has been a really interesting discussion, and it's a shame we're running out of time at the end here. There's something's jumped out at me in what we've just said. Larry, you said that rather than lump this into the appeals process, are you saying that it would be better that when the SQA are moderating grades, in some cases downwards, that instead of doing that and then relying on the appeals process, they should instead contact the schools or the teachers to get some rationale as to why these grades are so high, so that they may not have to mark them down, and that would reduce the amount of appeals that perhaps take place? Because that sounds like a very sensible suggestion you've made. But the bigger point here is what's going to happen is on the 4th of August, grades will come out, and a huge amount of people may want to appeal those, but it's the teachers and the schools that are going to have to pull together the evidence for the appeals, because the SQA have iterated this week that they won't accept an appeal unless there's evidence to support it. And who's going to have to put that together? It's going to have to be the teachers, and that's a week before schools are going to reopen. How on earth are they going to do that? Put together all that evidence when they're supposed to be planning for the reopening of schools? It sounds to me like there's a huge clash of timing here. Do you have any views on that?
Mr. Flanagan?
Yeah. So on the first point, that is what I think both Jim and I are advocating, that there should be, if the statistical modelling throws up either too positive or too negative in terms of the results, there should be a dialogue with the school to try and reach an agreement around that. And if there's an understanding there, then that might avoid a raft of appeals from that school. When we get to the appeals process, the schools will be submitting the evidence upon which they made the judgment in the first place. The difficulty is SQA saying only the evidence, but in the estimates process, they also said you could infer progression from classroom observation. So, the estimates are based upon more than just the physical evidence that will end up being in appeals. And I do think if we have, beyond the normal range of appeals, then that becomes a huge issue for secondary schools to process, particularly if some of those appeals are around students who have got, who are moving to university and who need results and have to be prioritised. So I just think we should just manage the system based upon professional dialogue, which has been the kind of basis for. The schools have had a professional dialogue around the estimates involving more than just the individual teacher. It's been led by principal teachers. They've been discussing with senior management team. There's been discussions with local authorities. So the whole process has been kind of moderated by a professional dialogue already. SQA should just continue that approach to minimise the potential for appeals come August.
Mr. Thewliss, I know you've answered part of that in your previous answers. Have you anything else to add?
Can't disagree with that. Just one point to add to that. Given the 4th of August, no one really knows what life is going to be like come the 4th of August in relation to getting people into school and the way in which we start to produce, physically get evidence to produce it. So it's just another wee thing to add to that discussion. But the notion of preempting a challenge before it becomes a challenge is, what we're talking about here. Continue the process of professional dialogue that has been conducted all the way through the system in relation to teacher estimates. Then you've got a chance of giving the system a credibility. If you don't do that, you're taking it the other way.
I have one final question, and I appreciate it's quite a big question. So if you prefer to answer in writing with information to the committee, we'd be more than given time to hear that. But it's actually about issues that the committee have looked at in the past, specifically around the challenges for particular subject areas, science in particular, physics and maths. And Larry said that this is possibly the biggest curriculum challenge of the century. And Jim, you also talked about getting back to the previous curriculum as was. However, I do have severe concerns about science and practical science teaching, given that we've also lost a number of technicians from schools. And in the areas of music, something that's been very close to the committee's heart as well, is it's difficult to see and understand if there's an impact on wind instruments, in particular brass and wind instruments, in terms of the risks associated with COVID-19 around those, and how you would possibly have a socially distanced choir or orchestra in a school. And Jim, you're on my screen, so I'll go to you first for that one.
Trying to answer that question in the time we've got left is, that's a wee bit of a challenge, Claire. But the point is well made when we start to look at the curricular provision within school, and the ones you've touched on are perhaps the most obvious ones. There are all sorts of other aspects to the more so the practical curriculum within schools and the way in which it's delivered. If you start to look at home economics, for example, if you start to look at PE, whole areas of the curriculum which are dependent upon close physical contact, preparation of food, that sort of thing. There are aspects there which are deeply ingrained within curricular provision, deeply ingrained in the way in which you assess young people's progress. Major issues in relation to the way in which that curriculum is going to be delivered. Even if you could have young people in school under normal circumstances to do it, how do you develop that and take it forward? How do you take forward a higher physical education course through distance learning and young people at home? So there's huge questions in relation to the way in which the curriculum is delivered in relation to these subjects.
Mr. Flanagan?
Yeah, those challenges are acknowledged and being looked at through some of the work streams that are ongoing. Not just in terms of qualifications, because there are current elements of some qualifications which couldn't be delivered. If you look at drama, for example, then you have some challenges around your performance, and in terms of craft and design, not the best health and safety approach to be 2 metres away from a child using a lathe for the first time. So there are considerations around all of that in terms of. I think there's a general agreement that we need to find a way to make these subjects work, rather than the subjects becoming marginalised because of the challenge. But it might mean modifications in terms of what has been delivered. Jim mentioned PE there. We're not allowed to have physical or team sports, then PE departments might have to look at other alternatives. So it's a big work stream, but it is being looked at, although no immediate solutions. As with a lot of these things, the challenge is there.
Yeah, I'm sure it'd be interesting to the committee to have updates on that if you have any going forward, because we wouldn't want to see subjects disappearing for from the curriculum, and those opportunities for young people, even in the short term, been limited. But thank you very much. It's been a mammoth session this morning, and I do appreciate everyone for their time this morning, particularly Larry and Jim, and I hope you understand it's because of the importance that the committee has in the areas we've discussed today. It's been an excellent session. So thank you very much for your attendance, and I'm going to suspend for 5 minutes and then move into private session with the rest of the committee. So thank you.